Good evening and welcome. I'm Robert Watts. When you talk about American history, you talk about the rights and liberties American citizens enjoy. However, during the early 1900s, we saw a time period of limited rights and limited freedoms. This time period was known as the Red Scare. I'm here tonight with Rachel Siegelman. Rachel Siegelman, hi, how are you doing?
Good, nice to meet you.
Rachel Siegelman is supposedly an expert on the early 1900s Red Scare. Let's see what she has to say about some important details of the actual history of the Red Scare. So, Miss Siegelman, when we talk about the Red Scare, we hear the term xenophobia.
This is correct.
Now, xenophobia is defined as a fear of something that is different. How were the American people afraid of the changes in the United States during this time period?
Well, I feel, Robert, as people in America were very for the war at this time. And
That's true.
the foreigners and communism threat coming to our country made people feel as if the Americans would stop feeling so strongly about the war efforts and more for a different kind of government.
Now, where did this threat come from? Who was the threat? Were they American citizens?
Well, the immigrants were more of the threat to America at this time, once again because they were bringing new ideals and a new type of government that we weren't really for and raised to be about.
What was the new type of government that the immigrants from Europe during this time period brought with them?
Well, it was a communist government, and communism was defined as an all power over the people instead of the freedoms and rights we were used to as Americans.
As we all know, communism is a system of government that places the good of the community above the good of the individual. Now, in America, especially during this time period, the good of the individual was placed far above the good of the community. To make the American people feel safe, the United States government passed a series of bills. The Espionage and Sedition Acts were used to limit the rights of the American people. Can you provide us with an example of when an American's rights were limited by the Espionage and Sedition Acts?
Yes, Robert. The case of Kate O'Hare was a good example during this time of a citizen's rights being restricted or taken away from them. She was put in jail for speaking out against the war.
The Espionage and Sedition Acts began to make people afraid of their government. The Attorney General during this time period was a gentleman named A. Mitchell Palmer. Mr. Palmer is famous for the events known as the Palmer Raids. Let's talk about the Palmer Raids. What were the Palmer Raids, and how were they an example of the government abusing its power?
Attorney General Mr. Palmer used his powers illegally to target certain socialist groups. He ordered illegal search and seizure and the deportation of hundreds of socialist immigrants.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for our interview, but it sure was a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Robert.
Absolutely. Well, that certainly was enlightening, but let's review our essential questions before we end our program. Question 1. Understand how fear affected American ideals. The public fear during World War I created an epidemic of xenophobia. Certain groups were targeted for supposedly being against the war effort. Question 2. Understand an example of how a citizen's freedom of speech was violated. Kate O'Hare was tried and imprisoned for speaking out against the war effort. The Espionage and the Sedition Acts ignored citizens' freedom of speech. Question 3. Understand how the government's power was abused in the name of public safety. The Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, conducted raids against Socialist Party members on two separate occasions. He ordered the deportation of certain individuals from the United States. Over 500 were eventually deported.